So good morning. Thank you so much for joining me again this morning. I'm just delighted to have you all here. Once again, I'm Maureen McGuire. I am in my 4th year. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in the Visual Studies Department at UCSC. And if you hear some barking, it's my little dog behind me. So I'll try to keep him quiet. He's still in his morning nap routine, so he's been pretty good. But we left off last week talking about marriage for women, and this was a natural progression for women. They were born, they were raised by primarily their mothers, and they were taught in Christianity, they were taught in the sociocultural constructs of rooted in classical antiquity, but that also has changed a little bit as time progressed. Women were usually married not too long after they reached monarchy, and so after their first period, they were quickly sort of married off. And these marriages, we have a lot of symbolic references to these marriages. Here's a signet ring from the 5th century. This was actually unearthed in Egypt, and we actually have a lot of great material from Egypt with a Christian in a Christian context, especially before the sort of Arab conquest and the introduction of Islam. And of course, Egypt is great because it's very dry and quite, it allows for the preservation of material. So we actually have some textiles from ancient Egypt that hopefully we'll get to. We'll see if I can move quickly along. But these marriage rings usually depict the two parties, the man and the wife, and they are facing each other. And this is a holdover from classical techniques. We see this in imperial contexts as well. So this, of course, is gold and yellow, and this would have been from an elite couple. We have most of the information we have about people's lives is from the elite, and this is just exactly what we were just talking about a few moments ago. This is because non-elite people weren't considered terribly important. They also didn't have a lot of jewelry or anything like that. That would have lasted until now. So most of what we know is about the elite, which again gives us a skewed understanding of the world at this time, especially in the Mediterranean at least. This is another of these marriage rings. I like this one because while we do have the indication of Christianity here with the cross here, and then we also have some sort of angels on the sides and these roundels. This gives us an even stronger connection to Christianity. We have the husband on this side and the wife on this side, and Jesus is here sort of reaching towards the husband, and Mary is on this side reaching towards the wife. And you'll recall that I mentioned last week it's a little difficult to discern who is who, but you do get a vague sense of a beard here on these two figures, and these two figures are beardless, so this would indicate that they are women for the purposes of this ring. I can't remember what this inscription is here. I think it has to do with sort of good wishes on the couple. And then along the exterior, we have these wonderful scenes from the life of Mary and the life of Jesus. And these are sort of warding off evil and also wishing blessings upon the couple, right? So here we have the Annunciation. So Mary is here and the angel is here. We can see the wings of the angel Gabriel. What I also love about this, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, is this textile coming out of this jar at the bottom. So this is a reference to this life of the Virgin. And she's preparing this textile for the tabernacle. So she's weaving this textile just as she will weave the body of Christ in her womb. So it's this symbolic moment. Then we have the visitation, where Mary is being greeted by her cousin Elizabeth, who is also experiencing a sort of miraculous birth. Then if we look at this scene here, which is just here, we have Mary reclining in this cave. And this is a Byzantine tradition. In Western Europe, we get this image of Mary in the stable. But in the Byzantine tradition, she's usually giving birth in a cave. And this is a reference to sort of foreshadow the cave in which Jesus will be laid at the end of his life. Right, so it's this sort of book ending of Jesus's life. We have the ox and the ass here, and then this is probably meant to be Jesus laying in a little cradle. Then we have Jesus's presentation at the temple. We have Mary and the priest at the temple, sort of taking Jesus. And then over here we have the baptism. And what's great about these scenes on this side of the ring is that they are references to not only Jesus, but also to successful birth of a child. And so this would have been a reference, especially important to a female who would have wanted to bear many children. And this would fulfill her role as a mother and as a woman, essentially, in this time period. So we see a heavy interest in birth giving and producing healthy children. And then these last three scenes here are the baptism of Christ. And then we have another scene from Jesus's life here and here. This is, I believe, Palm Sunday. And this is the, I'm not going to think of the word. When he goes to the mountain and he sees Moses and I think Ezekiel. I can't think of the name of that moment right now. But anyway, it's an important part of sort of the identity of
Transfiguration.
Jesus. Thank you, transfiguration. All I could think of was transubstantiation, and that's not this. Transfiguration, yes, absolutely. So these are important moments in Jesus's life and also in Christian theology at the time. So these may have been a way to identify the wearer and their beliefs in heterodoxy or not, or orthodoxy. So we have a couple different things going on. And then along the outside of the ring, we have this wonderful inscription. And I just have this little bit right here to show you, Kyrie, which is Lord. So again, this Christian context adjacent to this cross. So we know that this is a Christian, it's a marriage ring. There's messages about giving birth and successful marriage through the production of children.
Can I ask about the baptism one? What made you think that was showing baptism?
So here you have Jesus sort of down in the middle here. So he's being dunked in the water. And then here we have on either side, I think this is probably John the Baptist and the dove above. And then I'm not sure, this is probably one of the apostles.
Right, because I wondered if it might instead be the finding in the temple, just from the timing. That's an unusual presentation for the baptism of Christ.
In the Byzantine tradition, this is kind of normal, to have him sort of lower than these other figures on the side. Yeah, but that's a great question. Yeah. Yeah, there's no indication that.
Because I'm looking at what looked like the ovals round the heads, as if they were all three figures, as if it might be Joseph, Mary, and Christ, which made me think of the finding in the temple rather than baptism.
It could be. It very well could be. My question is about this sort of thing in the top, and that seems to be a dove.
Right. Okay. Can't make out what that is, but yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. These are quite difficult. That's
Not
my
surprised. It's a tiny ring.
that's my best interpretation. And given these other scenes here, it kind of makes sense as a progression on this side. So it's possible that that's the finding him when he's a child at the temple. Absolutely. Yeah. Now women, and this is a great segue back to our the title of the course. Women were seen as this, being on this spectrum between the Virgin and Venus, or this sexual temptress. Maybe Eve is a better sort of symbolic individual for us to think about instead of Venus. But many authors writing at this time focus on women and their connection to Eve and sin. Tertullian said, "You are the devil's gateway," and he's talking about women. "You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him, whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desert, that is death, even the Son of God had to die." So there was this belief that because of Eve's sin, Jesus had to come to cleanse the world of this sin that had been created by Eve. So these ideas were connected pretty strongly at this time in the Mediterranean. And we can see this, these ideas of women as being vain, sinful, leading men astray in other works of art. Because after marriage, it was important for a woman to bear children. And in order to bear children, you have to attract your husband to you, right? So that there will be this sex act, and there was this conception of a child. But this was, being alluring, tempting your husband was also sinful. So it was the right thing to do, but it was also the wrong thing to do, right? So there's this really strange and what I would consider quite confusing tension between these two things. And I love this object because it pairs the two really in these amazing ways. So we call this the Projecta Casket. Projecta was a Roman woman in the 4th century, so not long after the life of Constantine. And this is made of silver and gold, and it is about 11 inches high. So, just to give you a sense of the scale. We're not entirely sure what this would have been used for, but probably holding towels. And so this is part of this wonderful treasure we call the Theesquiline Treasure. It's in the British Museum now. And it's part of this whole collection of objects that a woman would have taken to the bathhouse with her. Most houses did not, even for the elite, did not have a bathing space. And so you would go to the public baths. And a very elite woman would have many servants going with her, some slaves going with her, and they would all carry these objects to go with her to the bath. And so this would have been for holding probably towels. And then over here, we're going to take a look at this object here, which has other little containers in it. So maybe different oils or perfumes or unguents that the woman would have needed. Then we also have some of these kind of belt objects here, some little plates, this wonderful platter. And then these right here are chair finials. And I will probably talk about these next week, but they're really wonderful, these chair finials. They would have gone on the tops of a chair on either side. But let's take a look at the Projecta Casket, which was found on the Esquiline Hill, supposedly, which is one of the 7 hills of Rome. And so just to give you a sense of where we found it, where Projecta may have lived. And women at this time were accused of really dressing themselves up. I actually, with this particular quote, I often think of like the Real Housewives of New York or Beverly Hills or whatever, right? Like these women who just really go over the top. So it kind of makes me laugh when I read this because I think of the modern, like a modern sort of interpretation of this. But Juvenile was this really grumpy guy in Rome. He was from outside of the city of Rome, and then he came to Rome in hopes that he would make his fortune. He didn't. So he was extremely sort of angry about this, and most of his writing is satire. And so this is a satire, but you can get the kernels of truth from this. He says, there's nothing a woman won't do, nothing she thinks is disgraceful, with green gems at her neck or pearls distending her earlobes. Nothing is worse to endure than your Mrs. Rich Bitch, whose visage is padded and plastered with dough in the most ridiculous manner. Furthermore, she reeks of unguents, so God help her husband with his wretched face stunk up with these smeared by her lipstick, right? So here's this one sort of side of this feminine identity, this stereotype of women. And then on top of this, we get added these Christian ideas about Eve and the root of woman being sinful. So women in sort of the pagan tradition are already viewed in this stereotype, and then we get this added on top. So women are really struggling. And Tertullian then goes on to say, to sort of compound this, you are bound to please your husbands only, but you will please them in proportion as you take no care to please others. So you have to be attractive to him, but don't worry about attracting other people. Be without carefulness, blessed sisters, no wife is ugly to her own husband. She pleased him enough when she was selected by him as his wife. Now remember that a lot of times a man may not have selected his wife. She could have been selected for him, whether commended by form or by character. Let none of you think that if she abstain from the care of her person, she will incur the hatred and aversion of husbands. So he's kind of cautioning them. Take care of yourself, but don't go too far. Every husband is the exactor of chastity, but beauty a believing husband does not require, because we are not captivated by the same graces with which the non-Christian think to be graces. So here he's saying a Christian man will love you no matter what. You know, you don't have to put all this makeup on that Juvenile is talking about. That's kind of a pagan thing to do. So don't worry about doing all that. But you know, we can think of these, even today, these tensions that exist between, you know, what is sort of like chic to wear and what we're comfortable wearing and things like that. So, yeah. He goes on to say, handmaids of the living God, my fellow servants and sisters, the right which I enjoy with you, I, the meanest in that right of fellow servantship and brotherhood, emboldens me to address you to a discourse, not of course of affection, but paving the way for affection and the cause of your salvation. So he's like, I'm saying this so that you go to heaven. That salvation, and not the salvation of women only, but likewise of men, consists in the exhibition principally of modesty. So I'm saying this so you'll go to heaven. You need to dress modestly. I like how he's kind of like giving himself a caution, you know, like covering himself with this like protective, I'm doing this for you. These suggestions are not made to you, of course, to be developed into an entire crudity and wildness of appearance. So he doesn't want you, the women reading this or hearing this, to go in the opposite direction and being totally austere and, you know, not combing their hair, not washing themselves, not wearing, you know, clean clothing. Nor are we seeking to persuade you of the good of squalor and slovenliness, but of the limit and norm and just measure of cultivation of the person. So you have to balance this very, very carefully. I mean, it's like a tightrope that these women are having to walk, because, okay, well, I can wear jewelry, but not that much jewelry, and I can put some stuff on so that I don't smell, but I can't wear too much. So it's this very thin line that women are walking. And here he talks about, I won't read this, but he talks about jewelry, and he says, you know, utilitarian things aren't made of silver and gold, so you know, if it's not utilitarian, you don't really need it, and all of this stuff. So he has this whole treatise on the apparel of women, especially. Interestingly, I don't think we have very much information on what men were expected to wear. So most of this attention is given to women. Whatever is born of the work of God, whatever then is plastered on that is the devil's work, right? So if you're putting makeup on, a lot of makeup, that's the devil's work, because that's not how God made you, right? So, yeah.
Maureen, can I ask you how you decided to pick those quotes to show us rather than, say, a biblical passage or something? I think you mentioned that this writer was not successful. So
I
how
apologize.
did you choose this?
So we have Juvenile, who was not successful, and then we have Tertullian here. And Tertullian was an important church father. He sort of, towards the end of his life, he sort of swerved towards heterodoxy rather than orthodoxy. So his later work is a little weirder. But this work from this period of his life was considered really good and important. So I chose Tertullian because he is a revered individual at the time.
And he was the father of what church?
Christianity.
Not the Byzantine church.
So at this point in the 2nd and 3rd century, there's really no difference. There isn't a division between Roman Catholic and Byzantine or sort of the Eastern Orthodoxies yet. That doesn't come until probably the 8th or 9th century. So at this point, it's still sort of one fairly homogenous church. We do have sort of some offshoots, but it's really still in its formative place at this point in the 2nd and 3rd century when Tertullian is writing. Great question. So if we get back to the Projecta Casket, we can see this tension really nicely in the imagery that we see. This and all of the objects in the Theesquiline Treasure, that big sort of collection of beautiful silver objects I showed you a few minutes ago, was probably given as a wedding gift to Projecta from her husband, Secundus. So this is Projecta, and her husband here is Secundus. And I'll show you, we do know their names because there is an inscription, and I'll show you that in just a second. And Projecta here is illustrated as a fine, learned lady, just like the woman from the sarcophagus that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, but by illustrating themselves with these scrolls, or the rotulus, they're illustrating that they are learned, that they're reading, that they're very cultivated women. And so it's interesting that Projecta wants us to know that about her, or her husband wants us to know about that about her on this object that is purely for beautification, so what we would sort of consider like self-care today, right? Going to the bath, presenting oneself to the public. So in this public-facing object, we have Projecta as this learned woman. So we have the scrolls here, and these are symbolic. And this would have been an easily read symbol at the time. People would have gone, oh, she's got a scroll. She reads, she's very smart. And just at the bottom here, it's very difficult to see. You can kind of see some of the Latin inscription at the very end here. It's a little bit blurry on this side. But the inscription says Projecta and Secundus in Christ. So Secundus, you can see his name here, and Projecta live in Christ, vivatis in Christo. Okay, so we see their names here. Now, it's not clear if Projecta was the original owner of this object, but kind of regardless, by placing this inscription on it, they are placing their ownership on this object and their identity on the object as well. So it could have been owned by a pagan woman who wanted to project herself as learned, but once it got into the possession of Secundus and Projecta, this sort of identity of the figure changes. You'll notice also the ways that Projecta is aligned here with Venus. And I like this picture here. So here we have Venus, and this is kind of that idea of kind of the birth of Venus. If you think of that Botticelli painting, right, she's floating into shore on this seashell, and so that's what's happening here. She is naked, and she's holding this Triton here is holding a mirror. And if you could see this in person, you'll just kind of have to take my word for it here, but her reflection is sort of stippled in on the silver mirror here. So we actually have this really careful attention to detail. And then just below, so we have Projecta here, Venus, and then just below that, we have Projecta again, or this female owner. So we have this amazing lineup here that creates this kind of lineup of the identity of the owner. And just like Venus here, the female figure is attended by these servants, serving women. And just as this Triton is holding a mirror, this female figure is holding a mirror, and Projecta, or this figure, is also stippled in. The reflection of the female figure is here. We even have this mimicry of their poses, right? Now, Projecta is clothed because this would have been the proper attire of a proper Roman matron. She would not have been naked in public. In the baths, yes. In public, kind of like this object is transcending these spaces, public and private. But here Projecta is fully clothed, enthroned, not on a seashell, but on this beautiful chair. And she is, doing her makeup. In this picture, actually, Venus has kind of a tool that we think would have been used to apply makeup. And so here we have a mimic of that. So it's this wonderful lineup. And then on the other parts, we also have what I call self-identifying, right? So we have this figure carrying an object that looks very much like the object itself, right? This chest looks like this chest. So it helps us identify what this object was used for, because it is reflected on the object itself. And we have some other examples of that too. We also have these beautiful gold and silver peacocks, a number of birds and other parts of the decoration. It's just beyond the sociocultural imagery, the craftsmanship is really amazing on this object, with the gold and the silver together. Really beautiful. So here we have that beautiful lineup, and even the lineup of the attendants on either side. So it's kind of taking that image of Venus and sort of flipping it and applying the contemporary sociocultural constructs of the time of the appropriateness of what a woman should wear, what servants should do, how they should appear, etc. So here again, we have the figures on the top. I was hoping you could see the stippling, but you can't, unfortunately, so I'll just move on. On the back here, so just on the other side of this roundel here, we have this scene. Again, it's self-reflective. So we have someone carrying this chest to the bathhouse, right? And so here's the main female figure being attended by a number of people. Here are some more attendants carrying objects that look almost exactly like the objects that are part of the Theesquiline Treasure. Bathhouses often had domes. They often had these columns. So this isn't a perfect replica of the bathhouse, but it gives us a general sense. And then the objects themselves, which are being taken inside. So this is the baths of Caracalla from the early 3rd century. So this could be a bathhouse that maybe Projecta visited. And we can see that there are a number of spaces. We have the natatio, the swimming pool, the frigidarium, the tepidarium, and the caldarium. And the visitor to the bathhouse would go through these various rooms in order to bathe at the time. It's a lot like going to a spa today and going to the steam room and then going into a cold room or a cold shower or something like that, and then into like a hot tub or something like that. So you go through these progressions and you would bathe. And this is what the interiors of some of them look like. Although we do have this brickwork here, a very fancy bath would have been covered in marble. So you wouldn't have been able to see this brickwork. It would have been faced with marble and then maybe had some mosaics. We also have this careful mosaic on the floor here, which is really wonderful. This is from a 12th century bathhouse in Thessaloniki, and it looks much more like the bathhouse that we see on the Projecta Casket itself, with the dome over the center and some of the columns and the arches across the facade. This is the interior of that bath. We see the dome, the brickwork, the columns. So this seems to be the way that baths were made for many centuries. And so this is the space that Projecta and other elite women and other non-elite women would have visited. This is the floor plan of the bath in Thessaloniki. So again, we have the antechamber, the warm room, the hot room, and then water for the heating of the water through the other spaces. So this is the other object that is part of the Theesquiline Treasure. And this is, we call it a casket, but it's just a little box with a lid. And we have some other containers inside. So these would have held the perfumes and the makeups maybe that Projecta would have used. Along the exterior, though, we again have this interest in not only mythology and sort of the pagan tradition, like Venus represents on the Projecta Casket, but on this Muse Casket, we actually have the muses, the 9 muses that were sort of, governed by Apollo, if you will. So this, we have the wreath, and this would have been locked. So we know these would have been expensive perfumes that the mistress of the household did not want anyone to mess with. And then we have the muses all along the sides. And just like Projecta on the larger casket, we have this muse here with a scroll, so indicating her learnedness. But the muses also project this idea of learnedness onto the owner of this object as well. So between the Projecta Casket and the portrait of Projecta with a scroll and this Muse Casket, we know that she was a student, right? She was a scholar, and she wanted the public to know this about her, or she wanted to really remind herself of this aspect of her identity. So I really love this object. Again, we have the wonderful craftsmanship, and then we have the muse of music here, the muse of theater here with this mask. So she's really showing herself as this woman of familiar with the arts and learning at the time. Just really fantastic. And then in these architectural spaces, again, hinting at this idea that women are enclosed. If they're not at home, they're in the baths, but they go straight from the baths back to home. They're not messing around and gossiping on their way to and fro.
A question, Maureen.
Please.
So these are really thought out objects. So who is the designer, the artist or the owner?
That's a great question. And it's kind of this debate that will never end because we don't know. Later, we do have, like in the Renaissance, we do have contracts between the artist and the patron. And the patron will say, I want an image of Mary with this person, and this person. Or I want Jesus at the Last Supper. And I want you to use this amount of red and this amount of blue. And the blue I want you to use is from this mineral. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of a contract from this period. So we don't know. But I imagine it's fairly similar in that a patron would say, hey, I want a casket with the muses on it, right? Or I want a casket and can you have Venus and a matron, an elite woman on it. And so then the artist is using these tropes that they're familiar with to display on the object itself. But it's really hard for us to say. And it's probably a combination. And the reason I pulled this mosaic in, this is from North Africa, from Tunisia. This is a floor mosaic, but it's really the exact same thing that we see. We see the proper Roman matron on a throne looking in a mirror. And this is great because you actually can see the reflection of the figure here. The servant is holding it for the matron. And then we have these other objects that are reflected in the Theesquiline Treasure. We have the casket with towels. So this helps us understand, the use of that other casket. We have this sort of platter here, different pictures. And then I love this because it looks almost exactly like the Muse Casket that we looked at before. So we have this sort of octagonal, hexagonal container. And then you see the chain on which it was held kind of encircling the object here. And if we go back, you can see that the chain here would have, you could carry it from this chain along the top. So these seem to be kind of the objects of a woman's toilette. This is what a woman was using, and these seem to be ubiquitous sort of tools. The Safso treasure is very similar to the Theesquiline treasure. This is in Hungary. And we're gonna just take a look at this little casket here. Again, very similar to the Muse casket and to that casket from the floor mosaic. And here, again, we have a woman in the center. She's very beautifully dressed. We have the figure with the mirror here. We have some other figures with her other tools for her toilette here. And this is just a closer detail. And then we have some sort of mythological figures on the side here. And then on the back, we actually have the figures in the act of bathing. So here we actually have some naked female figures, but we get the sense of how the baths worked. We can see that there are women in various poses of undress. And then we can also see the textiles that would have hung down to divide the space and add privacy between, say, the frigidarium and the caldarium and the tepidarium, or the gymnasium. So there are these women in various phases of dress and undress. We have these basins that they would have used for water and bathing themselves. And this woman is actually carrying one of these pitchers of water. But this gives us a sense of what women were doing in the baths. This is from the Piazza Armerina in Sicily, and this gives us a sense of women exercising. So yes, women exercised in bikinis. So the various stages of undress, women were also exercising. And if you go back to the images of the baths of Caracalla, there are two gymnasiums on either side of the bath section, the bathing section. But I love this. She's got like these dumbbells in her hands, and she's, like doing some exercising. And then here, this must be a figure who is, she's won some type of a competition, and she's crowning herself with the crown of victory. Yeah. So women we're caught in this spectrum of being attractive, not being attractive, being a good Christian, being a good wife. And then you have this tension between the secular world and the non-secular worlds that women were caught between as well. So yeah, but the idea was to attract your husband, to procreate and produce children. And motherhood was probably the longest period of a woman's life, or the shortest, as it may be. And motherhood was sort of the goal of marriage. The idea was to produce children, but of course, being a mother, being a child was quite dangerous. Women died in childbirth, and so did children. About 40% of children did not survive to adulthood, and malnourishment affected children deeply. It made them more vulnerable to disease. So they could die of malnourishment, or they could die of a disease that was exacerbated by their malnourishment. So very challenging. And we can imagine it was easier for elite people who had access to food and nutritious food, whereas non-elite people definitely were struggling a lot. Metochites, in the early 14th century, he's an important church leader and politician. He actually mentions the death of his child. Some people I have heard some scholars say, oh, people didn't really cry. They weren't really upset when their children died because they were used to it. They just knew that their children were going to die. But he says, what shall I say of the sudden mortal end of both my dearest younger children? Remarkable for their beauty and intelligence, upon whom I looked with sweetness, good hopes for them being poured round my heart. So we get a sense of how people dealt with childhood mortality. It was not easy. It happened a lot, but that didn't make it any easier. Breastfeeding, of course, could help with the nourishment of a child. And just as we know today, breastfeeding and nursing actually do have some really important salubrious qualities. They do give some kinds of help with the child's immune system, and also breast milk is important. It can help to heal other ailments. So we have examples from ancient Egypt when a woman would put some of her breast milk on a child's infected eye, and the eye would actually heal because of the salubrious qualities of the breast milk. Although we have only a few excavations from this time period that help to support this information, from what we know, the remains of young children from the Byzantine world suggest they were breastfed until the age of 3 or 4. And so they were probably not only breastfed, they were probably eating solid foods in addition to the breast milk. But breastfeeding would have been extremely common. Today, we do have these kind of hot topics of breastfeeding in public, but I have a feeling people just saw women nursing their children all the time. It was a very ubiquitous scene. Breasts were considered sort of this erotic body part, but for the utilitarian purposes of the breast, I think it was very common. Again, by the ages of 3 or 4, breast milk was not the only child's food source. But it was widely observed in history, in medical texts. The doctors observed that children who stopped breastfeeding died. So it was this life-giving source for many children. It was widely observed.
Maureen, question. Yes. If a child is being breastfed till 3 or 4, doesn't that negate the interest in continual procreation? Wouldn't they be having children every year to 2 years instead of every 4 years? Because that would be a real diminution of the whole point of the thing.
And I just have to say that I have a feeling women were breastfeeding other people's children.
Oh, okay.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, wet nurse.
Exactly. Like, honestly, I think that people were probably like, oh, are you hungry? Come over here, come to Auntie whoever, and I'll breastfeed you. I think it was kind of like this shared responsibility.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that, but I have the feeling that happened, that, yeah, there were wet nurses. It wasn't just the mother constantly breastfeeding.
Freeing her up to have more children. Freeing
Exactly.
her up to have,
Yeah. And can I ask what you mean by malnourishment? Are you saying that they were not getting enough food, or that they were losing the protection of the breast milk against illness?
Both. So for a person from a non-elite household, it may have been quite difficult for them to get proper food. So malnourishment in one, not getting enough food, two, having only access to food with not the right nutrients for a child, and then three, after they're weaned, they are losing the protection of the breast milk, the sort of supplements that come from breast milk for a child. But that's a great question. Yeah. So in some images, we do see women breastfeeding. And so here we have a sarcophagus of Marcus Cornelius Statius, and we actually see his name here. And we see that we have a few scenes of the life of this man. We have the man looking at perhaps his child with the mother or a wet nurse, nursing the child here, and then raising the child here. The child is doing some fun activities here, and then talking with the Marcus Cornelius here.
Maureen, how much did they know about the nourishment and the things that they take for granted now?
So I think they knew pretty close to the same things we know, but not to the detail that we know now. And this is a great question. I think there was some like magical qualities thought about breast milk. And I'm basing this in what I know about breast milk in ancient Egypt. But I have a feeling that some of these ideas crossed over into the time period that we're talking about now.
Well, not just breast milk though, but other foods as well. Was there some contemporary research or something that would give them an idea of what is most nutritious?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So yes, they probably did have a sense that children who get this kind of food are healthier than children who only have access to this kind of food.
Observation, right? Then.
It would be mostly observations.
Okay, thank you.
And kind of trial and error. We do have some medical texts that talk about herbs, and so they do understand things from observation, but as far as a really careful analysis, no.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is this sarcophagus of a child or of an adult?
Probably the adult, but possibly the child. It's quite long. It's almost, it's 4'9", so I have a feeling it's the adult, the man here.
Because I saw it differently. Saw the child breastfed, then the infant being carried by an adult, then the child playing, learning to drive small animals, and then the child with his teacher learning to become an adult.
That's possible. I think
because both of them have a scroll in their hand.
They do.
The child and the adult.
Right. That's possible. I think we have an inscription of the figure, the deceased role here. This is the abbreviation for his title. So I think it was an adult who had reached adulthood and was serving in politics. But that's a great question and easily an applicable interpretation of the imagery. Absolutely. Absolutely. If we take a closer look at this image here, we do very clearly see a female nursing a child. And nursing was an important part of motherhood. And if you didn't nurse your child, it was considered kind of bad. Now, for an elite woman who had a wet nurse, this was kind of avoided. But for women of a lesser social standing, it was really important for them to breastfeed their child. So we have Ceranos of Ephesus, a medical practitioner, who said, if the circumstances allow a choice of women able to suckle, one must select the best and not necessarily the mother, unless she also shows the attributes characteristic of the best nurses. So if possible, if you have a selection, you want to pick a robust woman, a healthy woman. And so there is this observation that that's not always the mother. And of course, we know that many women, their milk doesn't come in, the child doesn't take to breastfeeding. So there are these many circumstances that don't allow for breastfeeding. And in a country where there's a shortage of formula, we know that this is a really important thing to consider. Breastfeeding was so important that in this image here, we have, this is from Chania in Cyprus. This is from quite a bit later, but here we have a woman who is being tortured in hell because she did not breastfeed her children. And we see that she has these snakes wrapped around her body, and she's in these flames here, right? And the snakes are actually biting her breasts. And so the body part that was the root of her sin is the body part that's being tortured here. So we have these other graphic scenes of fornication.
Yes, you do.
Here, yes, and then we have these other horrible scenes here. This man's penis is being bitten by a snake. This woman's vagina is being bitten by a snake. But the woman who did not breastfeed is put in the same position as the people who are fornicating. So this is how much pressure was put on women to breastfeed, at least in the 1370s in Cyprus. But we can imagine that there were some similar stereotypes applied to women before that. There were also instances of people abandoning their children. There were methods for aborting children, but instead of setting up adoptions, we have this practice of abandoning children. And in the Code of Justinian, there are laws that are made about abandoning children. And Justinian and his advisors said every person should support his own offspring, and anyone who thinks that he can abandon his child shall be subjected to the penalty prescribed by law. I can't remember what that penalty is. It's probably a financial penalty. But yes, abandoning your children, although people did it, it was frowned upon. So it's unclear what modesty rules applied to breastfeeding women. Again, I think it was fairly common for people to just see in their daily lives women breastfeeding their children. Maybe if it wasn't your immediate family, you were watching your mother or your aunts, your sisters breastfeed their children on, a fairly regular basis. So this would have been a very common thing for everyone to see, perhaps not in public, but it definitely in their daily lives. And so the fact that it must have been such a ubiquitous image is interesting to us because there are actually not that many images in the Byzantine tradition. In the Roman Catholic tradition, yes. In the Byzantine tradition, images of the Virgin breastfeeding are fairly comparatively rare. And this is weird because she is revered for her motherhood, right? If there is this stigma put on women for not breastfeeding, why is the Virgin rarely depicted breastfeeding? And so this is something that scholars are really confused about, and so they question it. She was unlike many other women in that she supposedly experienced no pain in childbirth. And then after the birth of Jesus, she supposedly never consummated her marriage to Joseph. She was a prominent intercessor for women and men who desired children. We can see that in the ring with the images of the Nativity and the Annunciation, etc. And then she also experienced the loss of her divine son. So she could have been someone that women could really sympathize with, but also feel alienated from, right? She has some similarities, but then some differences as well. One of the earliest images that we think is of the Virgin is this image here. This is from the Catacomb of Priscilla. And it's this figure here. So this woman. And she's sort of looking at this woman in the orant pose here. And she seems to be breastfeeding. Her breast is not exposed, but she's holding this child sort of in that vicinity of her breast. And so we think that this might be the Virgin. Again, this is early enough that Christian images are a little vague. There are just sort of some context clues, but we think this is the earliest image of the Virgin breastfeeding. Later images also illustrate the Virgin breastfeeding. So here we have a fresco from Aegina in Greece, and this is the Nativity. And here in the center, we have Mary, and her breast here is exposed, and she's actively feeding the child here. And she's surrounded by the other figures associated with the Nativity. We have the Magi here. We have the shepherds here, here. And the angel is announcing to the shepherd, hey, go and talk to this woman. And then here we have Joseph, and he's really tired, and he's looking up at the Virgin breastfeeding the child. So this is just after Jesus is born, and she's breastfeeding him. Many of what we call the galactotrophusa images, and that's Greek for milk nourishment, essentially. Galacto is milk, and trophusa is nourishment. And so many of these images adorn the walls of a monk's cell. And we think that this might be a connection, this might represent this connection between the ascetic lives of a monk, right? They're purposefully not eating a ton of food, right? And so by looking at these images of the galactotrophusa, they might be spiritually nourished by looking at them. They might be spiritually relieved of hunger pains by looking at images of the Virgin nourishing Jesus in a way that Jesus's body nourishes the monk in the Eucharist. So this may have been sort of this way to abate some of these physical pains that the monks were experiencing. So this is from Saqqara in Egypt, from cell A, and we have this niche with the Virgin suckling Jesus here. And many of these images appear in the cells of Egyptian monks. This seems to be fairly unique for Egyptian monastic practice. And here again, we have the Virgin. Here we have a censer over the top, and then just kind of her nipple, and she's pressing it towards the mouth of Jesus here. But she's enthroned very regally in both of the images, right? So we see that she is given her due praise in the image. And we think that images of the breastfeeding Virgin are not popular in late antique, or at least Byzantine visual culture, because they made the Virgin too relatable, right? And if you want to elevate the Virgin above all other women, this may have been this patriarchal tool So if you're not showing these images, women can't relate to her because she's too far above them. And prior to the 7th century, there seems to have been this practice of after Christmas, women would celebrate this this event that mirrored events for women in everyday life. So there was this festival after a child was born, and they would sort of honor the mother. So in the Council of Trullo from the late 7th century, they said, wherefore, since some on the day after the holy nativity of Christ our God are seen cooking semidalin and distributing it to each other on pretext of doing honor to the purpurea of the spotless virgin maternity, we decree that henceforth nothing of the kind be done by the faithful. So a woman would give birth. The next day, these people would give her this special bread, right? And it was this celebration of the birth, the healthy birth of the child, the successful, life of the mother. And so they would have this festival. So the virgin, right, would be honored in this same way the day after Christmas, the celebration of the birth of her child, right? So this was a common practice. And so the church is saying, nope, you can't do that anymore because the virgin is better than any other woman. So they had this whole church rule, this canon made to outlaw this practice. They continued to say, for this is not honoring the virgin who above thought and speech bear in the flesh the incomprehensible word when we define and describe from ordinary things and from such as occur with ourselves, her ineffable parturition. If therefore anyone henceforth be discovered doing any such thing, if he be a cleric, let him be deposed, but if a layman, let him be cut off from the church. So let him be excommunicated. So the virgin was better than any other woman, so much so that they kind of prohibited any practices that made her like another normal woman. So child rearing was also heavily monitored by the church and by society. So from the Psalms, we see that children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring are a reward from him, like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. So many children are ideal, giving birth and having many, many children. So here we have the Vienna Genesis. This is a beautiful text, a beautiful manuscript, and it's amazing because all of the pages were dyed purple. And of course, purple is the color of the imperial household. So I have these images here. Here we have Adam and Eve. So Eve is the first mother and also the first sinner. And then here again, we have the transfiguration. Other images from the Vienna Genesis illustrate proper motherhood. And this is a scene from the life of Joseph, excuse me. And here we have Potiphar's wife, and she's trying to seduce Joseph here. But then here we have some sort of everyday scenes of women and children. So here we have the women. Here's this woman with the baby in the cradle, and she's kind of playing with him. And here we have a woman with a spindle and thread, so she's preparing this textile. And then here we have some more women with children, caring for the children. So this just gives us an idea of kind of the everyday lives of women, how they were rearing children, what they were expected to do. This is a nice vignette that gives us a sense of what children's lives were like in tandem with their mother. So Genesis says, so Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. Potiphar did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me, but he refused. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, Joseph went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by the cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. She kept his cloak beside her until Potiphar came home. She told him this story: that Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. Potiphar took Joseph and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So this gives us a sense of what is supposed to be illustrated here, right? So she's pulling his cloak, and then he's out here in the safety away from Potiphar's wife, but without his cloak. So that's the scene that we're looking at. But it gives us a sense of the subtext is the sense of how women were acting and children were being raised. Sorry, duplicate. So here we have women with children and then also working textiles. And these were synonyms. So weaving was a synonym, not a synonym, but a symbol of raising a child, right? So just as you're weaving this textile, creating this sort of new thing, they are weaving children in the womb and then raising them to be beautiful Christian individuals. So we have this nice symbolism along with this vignette of what childhood was like. This is a wonderful mosaic from Kora. This is in Istanbul, Turkey. And this is actually the Virgin in the center. And we can see that the parents are really doting on her. And so it's just like any newborn might experience today, with children and family members doting on them and cooing and singing. And then here we have a similar scene from the life of King David. So here we have, again, the parents just sort of cooing over the little baby, right? It's really cute. They're passing the baby between the two of them, the parents. And the Virgin especially has some wonderful images of her parents sort of just treating her like a baby and sort of emblematically adoring her. So here we have a scene when her father Joachim is kind of like showing her off to his friends. And then later in the story, as recorded by the Proto-Evangelion, Anna says, hey, she's got to go to bed. I need to take her to bed. So here she's taking the child to bed after the party. And she has this beautiful cradle that is probably more ornate than a non-elite child would have. But we get a sense of what the nursery might have looked like at this time. So here we have Anna passing Mary off to her husband Joachim, and he's at this party. And then just below that, we have Joachim passing her back and taking her to her crib here, and then sort of nursing her and playing with the Virgin here. This is another scene. This is from the birth of the god Dionysus. But again, this seems to be kind of the way these kinds of scenes were illustrated. So here's the god Dionysus. His mother has just given birth, and he's being passed to the midwives here. So this reaching out of the infant is a common motif that we see. So Proverbs from the Old Testament says, my son, keep your father's command and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Bind them always on your heart, fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will speak to you. So we know that motherhood was also an important time for teaching and instructing children. And it was kind of expected that a mother would not only teach the child the ways of running a household, but also in the Christian religion. And I imagine there were other stories and other oral traditions and songs that most children heard that we have no evidence of, that would have been, they would have had a didactic purpose to them. And so we can imagine that a child's first steps were marked by different songs or different festivals that we have no evidence of. And we know that women and children were sort of put first. And this is a great example of that, because we have no text that indicates that women and children were put first. But this is a mosaic from the Korah, and it illustrates the feeding of the 5,000. So here we have Jesus turning the loaves and fishes into numerous loaves and fishes. And we see that this mother and her child are at the front of the line. We have this older person and a mother and child in the front of the line. And this reminds me a lot of like if you ride public transportation, there will be seats for the elderly or women with children. So it's kind of that same idea. And yeah, so I have this picture here, reserved parking. And so these pink seats are for women with children or pregnant women. And then when I lived in London a few years ago, there were signs that always said, here, please give up this seat to the elderly, right? So it's very similar. And then here's this guy sitting in one of the chairs for the pregnant or woman with a child. We also have some texts from John Chrysostom. I don't think I'm running out of time here, so I don't think I'll read them. But he is telling the public how to raise their children with good qualities and not bad qualities. And we have, especially for women, the girl who has been reared in her mother's quarters to be excited by female ornaments, when she leaves her father's house, will be of sore vexation to her bridegroom and a greater burden to him than the tax collectors. So you don't want to raise a girl who is vain and concerned about her appearance. And then there are some other specific rules for women raising their children, women instructing their children on how to raise a household. I really like these images. These are from Egypt, and they are little toys, and it's a little doll. And so we get an idea that children, especially girls, were playing with these dolls, but they also taught the girls how to beautify themselves, how to beautify another child. And if you have read anything about child's play and pretend, we do know that children reenact what they see adults do. And this is a really great little dolly because of all of the textiles. I think there were 12 layers of clothing on this little doll with real human hair. And so it's kind of like a Barbie with many, many outfits, and many outfits that are beautiful or something that a girl sort of fantasizes about, right? So yeah, this is kind of like an ancient Barbie here. But girls not only learning how to be a mother, but also how to dress themselves and comport themselves through play. Pretty clearly indicated by this little dolly. And we know that women were, expected to be beautiful and wear beautiful textiles. And this would also have been related to their social status. So here we have the Empress, and she's the most beautifully arrayed, right? She has the most pearls, the most jewelry, the most elaborate fabric. So here she has this purple tunic on. And then the next most elite women are these two figures here. And we see that they are very beautifully arrayed as well. And we see especially that the rings on their fingers are particularly of notice to the viewer. And this would be an indication of their marriage. So important parts of their lives. Widowhood would have also been a big part of a woman's life. Most women married quite older men. And so these men may have died quite early on in their relationship, their marriage relationship. And widows were expected to be taken care of by the public, essentially. So the church took a special role in caring for widows. And in 1 Timothy, we read, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. The widow who is really in need and left alone puts her hope in God, continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. So there's this clear understanding that a woman who is not attached to a man has financial struggles, has social struggles, and has essentially security struggles. So it was considered better for a woman to remain a widow, but sort of spiritually better, but financially and socially, it was better for a woman to get remarried. And women could marry 2 or 3 times, depending on how many times they were widowed. Divorce was frowned upon, of course, so widowhood was the way to get out of a marriage. So the church had this established order of widows, and it was a paid role in the church. And there were a number of requirements that changed over time, but in general, she was at least 60 years of age. She had led a pure married life, and she had been married just once, and she had a reputation of good works. So she wasn't gossiping, she wasn't going around and, dressing too ornately. It's hard to say what a reputation for good works means, but I imagine it was quite subjective. But you can imagine it was quite difficult for a woman to actually be able to qualify for this, especially if she had to be married more than once for various reasons. And there is this story in the book of Luke. He looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, truly, I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all, for all these out of her abundance have put in offerings for God, but she out of her poverty put in all the livelihood that she had. So this would have been the sort of paragon of what an enrolled widow would do. And we see a number of images illustrating this widow. So here we have the youthful Christ figure with the halo and the purple robe. And the widow is putting her donation into the charity box, and he's sort of gesticulating towards her and probably imagined to be saying those words from the book of Luke. And also on the cover of this book, we have the widow here, and she's again giving her donation into the donation box. Here, instead of the youthful Christ figure standing, we actually have him sitting on the globe here. So this kind of throne of the globe and the world, the king of the world, the emperor of the world and the heavens. So these were the sort of biggest life events for a woman, but of course there were other things that concerned women, and this was their work. And I'll try to go through these so we can end in a relatively timely fashion. Although we don't know much about women's work, we do have archaeological evidence that indicates that they did work. And we also have biblical evidence that women were responsible for helping their husbands. In the book of Genesis, to Adam, God said, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. And we have a few images of Adam and Eve working together. So here we have Adam, and the inscription here says Adam, and the inscription here says Eve, and we see that they are tilling the earth, right? So here we have him cutting wheat, and Eve is here carrying that wheat. On another section from this casket, we have them working in producing metallic substances. So here, Adam is at the forge, and she is working the billows for the forge to heat up that fire. So they're working together. They're illustrated as helpmates. And we also see images from other manuscripts of women working in the fields. So here we have a woman bent over and collecting wheat, and here this woman is collecting grapes. So we do know that women were working. They weren't just expected to stay at home all day and run the household. They were outside working. This is not elite women, of course, but it was sort of the non-elite woman, the everyday woman who was out working. I really like this picture because it illustrates a woman with her husband, who is a butcher, well, presumably her husband. And she's actually keeping the records here. She's doing the math, right? She's keeping the books. So I really like this picture. It illustrates a woman actively helping and doing like the brain work, if you will. I mean, I know that being a butcher requires a lot of skill, but I don't know. This is a wonderful picture to me. So here she is keeping the books. And this one I really like. She's a hairdresser. So we have the figure seated here and the women working on the hairdressing. And then we have some attendants, very similar to the attendants we saw in the Projecta Casket. And we know that women were very careful with their hairdos. We have these wonderful examples of the Flavian women with these wonderful curls going up of their forehead. And every year I tell my students I'm going to figure out how to do this hairstyle and wear it for Halloween, but I haven't figured it out yet, so TBD. And then we have hair ornaments that mimic the hairstyles, especially of the Flavian ladies. So these are the type of tools that a hairdresser would use or a woman would have. And then we also know that women were working in health and medicine. Women were often sort of the medicine health practitioners of their small communities. Very few communities would have had a doctor, so it's very likely that a midwife was the closest thing to a doctor in small communities. And we do have evidence of female doctors. Sphanostrate lived in the 4th century BC in Attica. She was a midwife and doctor. And this was, we know this because of her epitaph. Oops. And then we have the words for doctor and midwife, and we have a female version of doctor. So Amaya is a midwife, and a Iatrinis is a female doctor. So we do know that there were female doctors. We have records that indicate this. There were hospitals in Byzantium, and one hospital at the Pantokrator Monastery in Constantinople actually had a women's ward specifically for women. So we do have some very clear evidence, both literary and like these physical wards that indicate the care specifically for women. The Pantokrator is now a mosque, so very little of the interior is the same, but we can see the exterior did have a hospital. But many people sought treatment at churches or other holy sites as well. So medicine was this balance between sort of observational, what we would consider medical or scientific care now, and what we might consider superstitious. This is a medicine box. And again, we have this marriage of these, Christian practices with the mythological past of the ancient Mediterranean. And so here on the cover, we have Hygeia, and she is feeding a snake. And I tried to figure out why she was always illustrated feeding a snake, but I couldn't find it. But she has the snake across her lap, and she's feeding it from this bowl here. And this would have slid over the top of this section of compartments. And so this was like they would have this in their bag, their doctor's bag. They would take this with them. Hygeia was the daughter of Asclepius. And so she is considered this personification of health and good welfare. And And we know that gynecology would have been an important part of health practice. And so I'll just try to blow through these, but we know that women experienced pain. We know that women had trouble conceiving. Zoe Carbonopspina especially, and she is illustrated here on this coin, had trouble conceiving. And so we have a lot of information about what she did to try to conceive. One thing she did was she wrapped a piece of fabric around an icon that was considered to help a woman conceive. And then after she took that textile and wrapped it around the icon, she wore it as a belt. So this was a way for her to help to conceive. And then we have the Theotokos of the life-giving spring. This is a copy of that icon that Zoe Carbonopsina had used. Ceranos of Ephesus is a doctor writing at the time, and he said a suitable midwife will be literate, with her wits about her, possessed of a good memory, loving work, respectable, and generally not unduly handicapped as regards her senses. She should be sound of limb, robust, and, according to some people, endowed with long, slim fingers and short nails at her fingertips. She must love work in order to persevere through all vicissitudes, for a woman who wishes to acquire such vast knowledge needs manly patience. So she has to be like a man in order to be a good midwife. I will finish in just 2 seconds. I just wanted to show you these images of women in active child delivery. So here we have the midwife reaching up into the woman's cervix, checking different things. And then we have this woman behind the mother is seated in probably a birthing chair, and they're sort of supporting her, right? Women often were seated in these birthing chairs, or they stood up. And we have some other images of Rebecca giving birth to her twins. And this is amazing because one of the babies is actually exiting the birth canal. So here's Esau. Let me go back. So here's Esau, the first twin born, and here's Jacob, right? And he's got the heel of Esau in his hand there, right? As is according to the narrative. But women often stood, and this allowed gravity to gently help the baby exit the birth canal. So many images from this time illustrate women standing or in these birthing seats. And this is in direct opposition to the way many women give birth today, which is kind of in this reclining position. Okay, I will end there for today, but if anybody has any questions, I'm very happy to take them.
I have a question.
Please.
Are the identities of the artists who created all these objects known?
No.
Or no?
No. It's one of the great tragedies, I think, that we don't know who created these. Sometimes an artist will write their name, but very rarely. Very rarely.
A lot of very complex work.
Very. And so, yeah. It's disappointing.
Okay.
Do we know if the artists were considered as part of the elite or well compensated? Or
that's a great question. So there's this kind of debate between an artist and like an artisan, right? There are some artists that we know of, their names. For example, we know the architects of this building behind me, Hagia Sophia. And we do know some architects' name. We do know some artists' names, but these would have been like the most, elite, sought after artists. Other artists who were making the sarcophagi, we don't know their names, even though they were obviously extremely talented individuals.
Wow.
Yeah, we don't start to know artists' names and architects' names until the Renaissance. So we don't know who were the main masons of, for example, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. So it's just wild to think about that. Yeah.
Were any women artists?
So we don't have any specific evidence that women were artists, but as we saw in the images, women were helping their husbands.
Right.
So I imagine women and daughters and sisters were helping their male family members in whatever work they were doing, making pots out of ceramics, probably cutting stone, making bricks, weaving. And then we definitely know that women were responsible for textiles. Women made textiles. But that's really the only thing we know for sure that they were doing. And we do know that men made textiles as well. So it's hard to say.
Okay.
It's frustrating for me at least.
Right. Right.
Okay, well, I think maybe we exhausted the questions here.
All
So
right.
one more lecture.
I know.
We get to see Maureen one more time. So
Just
a week
delighted.
from today, folks, please
Yes.
all return.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Another
Thank
great
you.
class.
I'm
Yes.
glad you enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
Have a great weekend. And
You
I hope to
too.
see you all next week. Take care, everybody.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.